I extend my heartiest welcome to all our scholarly friends who have braved the fanciful wiles of the internet to congregate virtually with us today. Today is the first day of our 3-day long webinar, and we have a host of eminent scholars who are going to speak to us today. We have a lineup that is really enviable. What I'm missing today is the real life welcoming of all my delegates, of all my research scholars, of all my eminent personalities who come and grace the seminar floor normally. But as times are difficult and these are distressing days, the warmth of the heart is not any less. So with all the courage and all the academic fervor that I can muster, I welcome Professor Narayan Bandyopadhyay, Hon'ble Vice-Chancellor of Bankura University. He, for us, is just our beloved DNB sir, without whom we cannot think of any academic venture at all. We also have today Professor Tabish Khair, all the way from Aarhus University in Denmark. We also have Usha Kishore from Edinburgh Napier University. But my colleague, when he introduces their lectures to you, will give you detailed introductions about them later. Today, as situations stand, the entire world is grappling with the incisive tentacles of the coronavirus that has somehow managed to take the entire globe in a vice-like stranglehold. Webinars like this, like the one we are hosting today, are our determination, our affirmation, our attempts to reclaim our lives, our academic existences, all over again. I would now, without much more ado, I would now like to hand over the virtual space to our Honorable Vice-Chancellor, Professor Dr. Dipak Kumar Kar, without whose enthusiastic support, keeping our academic instincts alive would really have been very difficult. So, folks, I present to you our Honorable Vice-Chancellor, Professor Dr. Dipak Kumar Kar. Sir, over to you, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Post-colonialism in literature is a rather alien field to me, but the entire world now is colonized by a very, very vicious virus, the coronavirus or COVID-19. And we are all longing to be decolonized from this one. Just a minute. Sorry. One good thing that has come out of this entire pandemic is that we all seem suddenly to have been wafted into a world that is much more tech savvy, much more digitally conscious than what we knew the world to be earlier in the pre-corona days. And this is why we are having this digitally arranged webinar today. So I heartily welcome, on behalf of Sidhu University, all the resource persons, the delegates, and the student participants who have thronged to the digital platform with such eagerness. Times may be difficult, situations may be adverse, but the heart still dares to breathe, to dream. Sidhu University has the mettle to square the adversity and come out triumphant with positivity, hope, and determination. We have here amidst us in this webinar eminent personalities like Professor Narayan Bandyopadhyay, the Honorable Vice-Chancellor of Bankura University, the great scholars like Tabish Khair from Aarhus University, Denmark, Usha Kishore from Edinburgh, Napier University, and in the coming 2 days, too, we shall have wonderful speakers like Professor Krishna Sen from Calcutta University and many other erudite speakers. So without any more, I welcome you all to this journey from real to virtual, from analog to digital, from seminars to webinars. Welcome again, one and all. May this webinar a grand success. Thank you all. Enjoy the seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Vice-Chancellor, sir. You are a constant support for us, and your words of encouragement will make the department to have more active role workshop webinar in near future. Now I request our registrar
জ্যোতি আমাকে শোনা যাচ্ছে?
হ্যাঁ, yes sir. Sir, you are audible.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody.
We cannot see you properly. Good afternoon.
Getting me, sir? I have allowed
Yes,
microphone and camera.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. You are perfectly audible.
Okay.
Sir, you are perfectly audible, sir. But sir.
আমি একটা মিটিং এ ছিলাম বলে ধরতে পারি, এখনো আছি, শুনেনি বলো।
My regards to Honorable Vice-Chancellor, sir. Very warm welcome to all the esteemed speakers and organizers. A team of organizers, head of the Department English, Jyoti Shankar, Shambhu, Apurva Saha, sir, and Professor Nivedita Mukherjee, Surabhi, my heartiest warm welcome everybody for organizers for taking up such a pertinent topic, regarding post-colonial negotiation. 1 or 2 minutes communication from me. Decision makers believe that Nehruvian paradigm has to be adjusted to new realities when we are in post-colonial country. We are leader of South Asia, but neighboring country are not always smiling with us. While India empowered, but still out of 5 permanent chair of United Nations, having 15% of world population, but 1% share in world trade. People speak emerging India will global superpower, but nation still self-confident. Surely, in these circumstances, post-colonial effect, how far deep-rooted, or if out of effect, what does India's resurgence imply? If I add the post-coloniality in Indian context, just my thinking I want to share here. You will continue to discuss in this assembly terminology like Aboriginal, Afro-Americans, anti-colonialism, apartheid, black studies, colonial discourse, decolonization, diaspora, feminism, fanonism, and so on. But my share is here. There is a direct connection between colonialist treatment of indigenous flora and fauna and treatment of colonized and otherwise dominated subjects and societies. The devastation of colonized place, potentially of the planet, paved the way for devastation of societies. That's why controversial contemporary global and national issues of environmentalism, ecological imperialism, ecofeminism, speciesism are with me. This haunts me. Just a little communication from me. Wish webinar of English department become a grand success.
এবার শোনা যাচ্ছে আমাকে?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, ইউ আর অডিবল স্যার।
আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ বল। জ্যোতি, আমাকে শোনা যাচ্ছে?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, শোনা যাচ্ছে।
আচ্ছা,
হ্যাঁ
And so on.
বলো। করেছি।
Okay. Sir, can you hear me now?
আমি তোমাদের গলা শুনতে পাচ্ছি খুব আবছা মতো। আমি কি শুরু করব না?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, আপনি শুরু করুন। তাই না জ্যোতি?
শুরু করব?
Sir, you are perfectly audible. To me, you're perfectly audible. I can hear you well and proper.
আমি কি শুরু করব?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, শুরু করুন।
স্যার, আপনি শুরু করে দিন। হ্যাঁ।
আচ্ছা, many thanks
Wow.
for kindly giving me this wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts in this international seminar. My topic, as you all know, end of post-colonialism. And many of the participants might suspect that is going to be a complete demolition of the citadel of post-colonialism, and may be reminded of Antony's speech in Julius Caesar. I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. But I have not really come here to bury post-colonialism. However, I would like just to rehash some of the very well-known points of beginning related to post-colonialism. In the first place, we would refer to Edward Said's Orientalism, which was published in 1978. It is considered to be the point of inauguration of this great movement of post-colonialism. Said, in fact, wanted to formulate a discourse by which European culture was able to manage and produce the Orient politically, sociologically, ideologically, scientifically, and of course, imaginatively. There might be many students who might be participating in this conference. So I'll just very briefly make a rehash of some of the important texts that were produced around that time. I would also refer to two symposia which were organized in the University of Essex in 1982-84, and the publication of the proceedings of that symposia as Empire and its Other. Here, Spivak and Bava inaugurated the beginning of a colonial discourse as a legitimate line of inquiry. I would also refer to Professor Bill Ashcroft, Helen Tiffin, and Gareth Griffiths' very important book, Empire Writes Back, which at that time almost became a textbook for all those who try to understand what post-colonialism really means. It was very popular in India, and many of the Bill Ashcroft actually came to Bardwan University and stayed here for 2-3 days, and many of the participants of that particular talk were worried about the question, how could Bill Ashcroft suddenly think that he should be able to write such a book? So on behalf of the participants, I asked him a question. Well, Bill, what is it that you suddenly decided to work on this area and wrote a very wonderful book? Bill Ashcroft simply smiled and said, well, things were very much there happening, and I wrote the book. There was Ngugi wa Thiong'o also, Decolonizing the Mind, 1986. This is a very important rejoinder to the study of post-colonialism. If we look at the beginning of the book, Decolonizing the Mind, you'll see that he is referring to a poets' meet organized by the British Council. At the time, Ngugi wa Thiong'o used to write poems in English, and he was invited to that particular poets' meet. But he was very surprised to see that many of the very major poets writing either in Gyuku or any other native languages were not at all present. So he could realize that it's meant for only those who write in English. So he could once again realize that there is, of course, a kind of contrapuntal relationship between the West and the rest. However, in 1988, a special issue of Critical Inquiry was published, and it questioned the problematics of race, writing, and difference. And then from New Delhi, Subaltern Studies, Writings on South Asian History and Society was published in 1988. It sought to rectify the elitist bias of imperialism. I would also refer to Robert Young, Colonial Desire, Hybridity in Theory, Culture and Race. I'll come back to him later as well. But right now, I would say that Robert Young also came to Bardwan University and stayed there for around 15 days, thanks to British Council at the time. And Robert Young, actually, as he was younger and me too as well at that time, we were very close. And he was very, very engaged with accumulating knowledge about India. And Robert Young, in this book, very important book, Colonial Desire, tried to determine the epistemic variables contained in a flexible regime constructed by the West. And then also there was Dipak Chakraborty. He started with his colonial world and then provincializing Europe, post-colonial thought and historical difference, which was published in 2000. He wanted to show Europe as the sovereign theoretical subject. Other histories occupy a position of subordinate, and history of Europe works as the master narrative. In other words, there is always an attempt to construct a hyper-real Europe. The reification of epistemic antinomies of knowledge and power, showing the evolving locations of nation-state, the developing subgenres of diaspora, exile, homing, dehoming, etc. I would also refer to Frantz Fanon, but he comes much earlier. Perhaps he foreshadowed the problematic of post-colonialism happening in 1978, but his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, 1952, and then The Nature of the Earth was published in 1961. But so there have been so many others who have been actually contributing very vigorously to the dissemination of post-colonial studies at the time. But at the same time, there had been controversies. There had been debates. I can just refer to Terry Eagleton versus Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak in the 1980s. Eagleton wrote a critique of post-colonial reason toward a history of the vanishing present in 1999. It was, in fact, a response to Spivak's essay, Three Women's Texts and a Critique of Imperialism. Here, Spivak took over Jen Eyre, White Sargasso Sea, and Frankenstein. Eagleton developed two distinctive charges, number one, complicity, and number two, obscurantism, and considered post-colonialism as the gaudy supermarket, helping the import of the third world intellectuals to Euro-American academies. Again, Colin Wright, while commenting on the Eagleton-Spivak debate, wrote, "To whom is Spivak speaking?" and asked, why did Spivak choose the European texts to realize this? I would not comment on such debates because you know that this happens. For instance, I can refer to Thomas Keneally, who wrote Schindler's Ark, and it got the Booker Prize, and he came to Calcutta to attend the Calcutta Book Fair, and he gave the inaugural address. Now, very interestingly, in that inaugural address, he said, well, it is very difficult to get the Booker Prize from Australia or from the Euro-American academies, but, well, it is very easy if you write wonderfully well in Asia, or best if you write from India. I would once again not comment on this. So there had been such, misapprehension, confusions, debates, but I would particularly refer to the PMLA issue 2007, May 2007, where we find a special issue, which is a special issue of end of post-colonial theory. Contention over the status of post-colonial theory in the geopolitical present. This was the essential point of contention. Sidney Smith and Jennifer Wenzel organized a panel discussion in the University of Michigan in 2006. They wanted to show, at least indicate, the exhaustion of post-colonialism as a theoretical paradigm. I don't agree with the kind of view that Arif Dilrik pointed out, but I can refer to his statement but I'm not with that statement. Arif Delrick said, post-colonialism begins when the third world intellectuals have arrived in the first world academy, and it ends when every department has hired a post-colonialist. Jennifer Wenzel looks at a specific time frame, end of Cold War, that is 1990s, and the 9/11. She refers to Niall Ferguson's very famous book, Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World, published in 2009. It's a huge story of imperialism, but contained in a sort of a slim volume of 400 about pages. He shows the rise and fall of the empire. The post 9/11 has reframed a new narrative of expansionist Manichaean foreign policy, implying a failure of post-colonialism. Even we should look at the official administrative standpoints. In 2004, a responsible officer of the notorious Bush administration said, "We are an empire now. And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you are studying that reality, we will act again, creating other new realities." Let me also give you another statement. This was made by Stanley Coates. Stanley Coates actually was a neoconservative member of the Education Committee of the US House of Representatives. He generally blamed Side's Orientalism as promoting area studies that wrested knowledge from the service of power. That means he wanted to create a kind of alliance between knowledge and power so that the hegemonic power can continue. He also blamed post-colonial studies as, number one, extremist, number two, anti-American apologia for terrorism. Very funny. Again, Homi Bhabha, while writing the foreword to the translation of The Wretched of the Earth 2004, recognizes the contributions of post-colonial theory. But he points out that the post-colonial theorists are working on wrong politics now, and they should reframe the decade-long debate on social equity and justice, because they have almost exhausted themselves all too much on culture wars, identity politics, politics of recognition, representation, etc. Homi Bhabha therefore radicalizes the study of post-colonial theory to some extent. Even Edward Said, at the end of his life, moved away from the celebrated post-colonial group, claiming that post-colonialism has become a misnomer that has scattered itself without recognizing the threats of neoliberalism, imperialism, multiple structures of dependency, and so on. Suji Tharu, she is attached with the School of Critical Humanities, University of Hyderabad, contends that Said's foundational text is, in ultimate analysis, not about the Orient, but about the Euro-American academy and the power-knowledge axis of those institutions. Even Spivak seems to have suffered a theoretical tension, as she constantly wavered among multiple critical choices like feminism, Marxism, deconstruction, and at one point even rejected herself to be categorized under the term post-colonial, and even considered it to be rather dated in an age of globalization. You can refer to her book, Death of a Discipline, published in 2005. Critics have even questioned the location of post-colonial geography. Fernando Coronel, for instance, categorically says that it has always the privilege of the Western academies. Latin America was never colonial in the sense India or Indonesia had been, he points out. Then Mamadou Diop categorically says that post-colonialism failed to account for the contemporary African condition. Ama Ata Aido, the Ghanaian writer, said post-colonialism was irrelevant to the United States, the power syndromes exerted by England and France, and to the imperial dominations of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And when the narrative is applied to the rest of the world, it's a mere, very strong word, a strong phrase, pernicious fiction. It's a mere pernicious fiction. Post-colonialism has been institutionalized by now, yielding repetitive theoretical acts, a rehash of theoretical autonomy enjoyed by the post-colonial theory roughly for about 3 decades, if we of course consider 1978 as the inauguration of post-colonialism. I myself also felt very, very tired when I used to teach in the University of Birmingham, and we had to take research interviews. Most of the research candidates would come up with either exile or diaspora or identity or representation, the same theories with different texts. So I was getting tired of this. However, Professor Hamid Dabashi is the professor of University of Columbia. He is the professor of Iranian studies. Wrote an article, Can Non-Europeans Think? Here he stands firmly against the post-colonial critique of building up an alliance of academic thinkers in terms of European paradigms. In fact, he was writing it as a response to the Barcelona professor Santiago Zabala's book or assessment of Zizek as a philosopher. In his later book, Dabashi's later book, The Arab Spring, The End of Post-Colonialism, published in 2011, he challenges the craft of post-colonialism. I quote his statement. We need to overcome the anxiety of Orientalism and shift our lens to our evolving history and stop trying to explain things so that fictive white man who sat in Edward Said's mind for a lifetime, that fictive white man is dead. He was never alive. He was a chimera manufactured by a post-colonial age. I will not comment on this. I would rather refer to Martin Heidegger's essay called The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking, published long back in 1969, in which he considered the idea of end not in a negative sense, nor as a stopping or termination. In fact, it foreshadows further epistemic reorientation and transformation. Before I proceed to elaborate on this, I should try to discuss some of the views of the French theoretician Jean-François Bayard. In 2011, Bayard wrote an essay, Post-Colonial Studies, a political intervention of tradition, in which he calls for reviewing the French contribution made much earlier in 1950s by Aimé Césaire, Léopold Senghor, Albert Memmi, Franz Fanon, etc., than what has been done later by the Anglophone world. I will not enter into this controversy. This is a controversy between the Anglophone and the Francophone claims on post-colonialism. He thinks that post-colonial studies is trapped in its contradictions. While claiming to be subaltern, it assigns to itself autonomy, self-reflexive appropriation of political modernity, though wavering in terms of its real ability to do it. He says, post-colonial studies reduces the action of the subalterns to a ritual of affliction in the service of a morbid cult of redemptive suffering. But it immediately brought about distinctive objections, especially from Robert J.C. Young. Robert Young wrote a very wonderful essay called Bayard's Broken Kettle. Here he sharply hit back in his response to Bayard's thesis by calling his ideas over-exaggerated, oversimplified, and overgeneralized, and even localized and parochial. He continues the theoretical battle in his next essay, Post-Colonial Remains. Young laments, I quote it in full, the desired dissolution of post-colonial theory does not mean that poverty, inequality, exploitation, and oppression in the world have come to an end. Only that some people in the US and French academies have decided They do not want to have to think about such things any longer, and do not want to be reminded of those distant, invisible contexts which continue to prompt the transformative energies. Transformative energies. This actually brings me to another aspect of this. What then is the nature of this transformation? I think the world as it had been in the 80s or the 90s is not what it is now. In the post-Cold War period, since 1990s, the rise of globalization discourse moved towards a new development. The rise of international mobility, political and economic transactions and investments, development of communication technologies, new market economy, etc., brought about an unevenness in socio-political, cultural, and economic reality. Even the communist China inaugurated the globalization policy for free trade and commercial expansionism. So long ignored as the global South, many South Asian and Southeast Asian nations opened up multiple forms of exchange and transactions. Even India, though a little later, realized the nature of this global transformation and moved forward to developing a neoliberalist approach by formulating Lucist policy, later transformed as Actist policy, further transformed as Act West policy. Many of these countries began to ink pacts and treaties in order to strengthen political, military, and economic networks in the form of joint naval and military exercises, in terms of FDI, foreign direct investment, or AFTA, ASEAN Free Trade Area, or NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, cultural exchange programs, etc. As a result, the concept of bipolarity or contrapuntal positioning of nation states began to disappear, being replaced by multipolar international relations. This new socio-political paradigm comes to be further celebrated by Robert Gilpin's book, Global Political Economy, published in 2011. In Gilpin's analysis, nation states and market zones are embedded in larger political, cultural, and social structures. There is therefore a tendency among all nations to emerge as global players. As far as literary and cultural praxis is concerned, there is a growing tendency among the academies to be part of a larger design of global humanities and social sciences. In the new global world order, the transnational corporations, the multinational corporations have begun to spread their tentacles all over the world, thereby leading to the creation of, one instance, sweatshop industries. What is sweatshop industries? Cheap labor. The production engaging cheap labor in the third world nations. The creation of sweatshop industries in the third world, even facilitating migration of third world laborers to other parts of the world. It is increasingly becoming difficult to identify a coalescing pattern by which to interpret multiple divergent issues. The economic crisis in the global order, state-sponsored genocide and terrorism, displacement and migration, giving rise to stateless people as it happened with the Syrians, the migration from Syria to Europe, etc. The Cold War and its end leading to new challenges in international relations, rapid labor migration from developing nations. Despite the growing trade of reformation of political and economic trajectories across the world can hardly free itself from the challenges which are intrinsically disparate and divergent. There is a growing tension, for instance, in South China Sea in terms of projecting military and naval powers, which involves some nations of South and Southeast Asia, with intermittent interventions of the US and other European nations. Again, the Chinese initiative of OBOR, One Road, One Belt, One Road, for strengthening economic relations, has been looked upon as a covert measure to build an economic empire, as also to use it as a new methodology for aggression. recent incidents of racist violence in the US, which is continuing, or the Chinese attack on the democratic agitation in Hong Kong, yes, it is continuing. The ongoing terrorist activities in Yemen, yes, continuing right now. Unrest and violence created by Libyan Nationalist Army, LNA, in Libya. The recent border standoff between China and India, not yet resolved. The Arab Spring, starting a few years back and still continuing in a scattered manner, are instances of ongoing culture clashes, which develop into attempts for building new power regimes. We are grateful to post-colonial theorists for drawing attention to new narratives of cultural production, finally being almost omnivorous in its claims for including all domains, almost all domains of human knowledge. The post-colonial theoretical paradigms may therefore be reconstituted or retransformed to make sense of the new problematic of connectivities. It's time now we had revised the earlier thesis and moved forward to transnationalism or transculturalism as a revised theoretical formation. Transnationalism may be regarded as a distinct phase of global modernity in terms of restructuring the post-colonial thesis. With the rise of globalization, Edward Said, in his Culture and Imperialism, seems to revise his earlier thesis of post-colonial binaries and states no one can deny the persisting continuities of long traditions, sustained habitations, national languages, and cultural geographies. But there seems to be no reason except fear and prejudice to keep insisting on their separation and distinctiveness, as if that was all human life was about. This revisionary stance of the post-colonial critic is also noted in Arjuna Appadurai, who seems to discover new formations of cultural dimensions in the age of globalization. Then Arianna Dagnino, the professor of cultural studies in the University of Sydney, appreciates Appadurai's revisionary approach to cultural forms as irregular, boundaryless, and without any clear structure. The transnational as well as transcultural critic Wolfgang Welsch refers to an interesting citation from Karl Zuckmayer's The Devil's Jungle, in which he posits a view of cultural mixes and permeation and concludes that all races of people with cultural permeation may conduce to a new form of transcultural celebration. I quote, they were the best of my friends, the best in the world. And why? Because the nations mixed there, like the waters from the spring and brooks and rivers that flow together in one great living stream. I'm very much reminded of what Tagore said much earlier. Ei Bharoter Mahamanovir Sagor Tire. Certain factors should be kept in mind in terms of the emergence of the thesis of transnationalism and transculturalism. The rise of global or international political economy largely developed a decentering of national economies through restructuring of a new global world order. The traditional segmental political as well as economic structure underwent a total disruption through new negotiations of power structures in Asia, Europe, and America. As a result, the sites of political and economic centers moved rapidly towards innovative mobility and expansion. This neoliberal economic order in the age of globalization gradually moved towards the obliteration of traditional borders. Though global political economy has been largely associated with trade and monetary relations, it raised a definitive awareness of territorial border crossing and transnational interconnectivity. Since 1990s, this global scenario in politics. One minute, please. In politics and economy largely impacted on traditional perceptions of nation state and cultural segmentation. The perspective of transnational ideology began to be largely initiated by the German theorists like Frank Schulz, Engler, or CC Health. Similarly, in the upper regions of Northern Europe, it began to be significantly canvassed by the Nordic network of scholars. It's pertinent. There are so many other informations. I just skip this. I'll rather come to Arianna Dagnino, who looks at the present age as fluid, neo-nomadic, proto-global times. Thus, transnational critics try to show how local or regional modernities move into a transnational environment. Dagnino comments that major institutes worldwide promote the study of representation of transnational culture and communities. This confluential nature of culture not only critiques the dichotomous nature of nation state, but also tries to reshape the so-called national collective imaginaries. This cosmopolitan vision in the age of transnational political, social, and cultural processes, the dominant post-colonial discourses come to be radicalized and transformed. The central argument of the project is that post-colonial theory, through its long run of around 33 decades, reveals new twists and turns. It seems that post-colonial phase proves to be inadequate in certain ways in interpreting the recent cultural perceptions. But to quote T.S. Eliot, "In my beginning is my end, in my end is my beginning." So there is no end or beginning. It is always a continuum and transformation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm not sure if everybody can hear me.
Hello.
Yeah, am I audible?
I just can't hear you. That is my problem.
Okay.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
You can hear me, sir? Can you hear me? Sir, your microphone is muted. Sir's microphone is muted. I'm not very sure whether people can hear me. Surely you can hear me, but I'm not very sure about the others.
Yeah, I can hear you
We
clearly.
lost video from sir as well, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not very sure whether Jyoti can hear me as well.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, I can hear
Yes,
you.
sir.
That's why I held it to my ears. You
Okay.
will not be able to see me. Yes.
Sir,
So
Jyoti
thank you,
is
Okay, sir.
going to take
Aparajita and
over.
all others.
So Jyoti is going to take
Yes.
over after this. But I just want to say that every time you speak, sir, it's a journey of wonderment, and it's a journey of, we just marvel at the level of your knowledge. And we are so lucky to have had you as a teacher. This is something that I want to say on a public platform so that people can understand what a great teacher you are, as well as a great speaker. Thank you, sir, as always, for being
Okay.
there for us
Thank
whenever
you.
we need you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful
Thank you
lectures.
very much.
Wonderful
See you
lectures.
again. Okay.
Thank you,
Wonderful
sir,
lecture.
for enriching us
Okay.
and inspiring us as
Thank you.
always. Thank you, sir. Will I introduce
Nivedita ji,
Tabish Khair?
over to you.
I'll start. So we
Yeah.
now have amidst us a person who is an admixture of almost everything. We are really proud to have amidst us Sir Tabish
Nirita, I'm not sure you're not audible.
Khair, who was born in Ranchi and educated in Gaya, Bihar, how to fight Islamist terror from the missionary position, published by HarperCollins, Interlink, and Corsair. just another translated into various languages, including 3 novels in Italian, Khair has won or been shortlisted for around 20 poetry, fiction, and non-fiction prizes in 7 countries. He has held guest positions in York University, Cambridge University, Leeds University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi University, Jamia Millia, and other universities. During the virus crisis, he has rewritten 21 Shakespeare sonnets as quarantine sonnets, sex, money, and Shakespeare. Kitab, Singapore, and the profits will go to a noble cause. It will be given to a COVID charity in Singapore.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly well.
Thank you for the kind introduction.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Welcome. Welcome.
Should I start or? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
It was absolutely a pleasure to listen to Professor Narayan Bandyopadhyay, who came up with such a wide-ranging talk. And the rest of you, my thanks to everyone, to the organizers in particular, Dr. Kumar Kar, Dr. Hon'ble, who have been corresponding with me, and everyone else who is here. I'm going to basically read out a paper instead of holding a free talk. And it's going to combine my personal experiences as an immigrant in Denmark with some theoretical positions. Some rather, let's say, unusual theoretical positions about resentment. Bear in mind, as among others, Pankaj Mishra pointed out in a book recently, this is an age that is very often characterized by various kinds of resentment. On the other hand, I have a certain perspective on it which connects it to post-colonialism as well. Now, to begin with, in my first year as an immigrant in Denmark, more than 2 decades ago, I recall walking into a small shop in Frederiksberg, a district of Copenhagen. It was the sort of one-door shop that stocks everything on cluttered shelves, cans of tomatoes and beans, cakes, packets of chips, sundry toiletries, beer, whiskey, all the way down to porn and similarly sleazy publications on its magazine racks in a corner. I struck up a conversation in Hindustani with its owner, who was a religious Pakistani. And as often happens, we told each other how we had ended up in Copenhagen, of all places. The elderly owner told me that his parents had migrated from India to Pakistan during the partition in 1947 because they wanted to live, as he put it, a pure life in an Islamic country. Then, with a gesture of sadness and despair, he pointed at the magazine racks and the bottles of whiskey, wine, and beer on his shelves. And he said, look at what I have to do here for a living. After that, he subjected me to a passionate harangue on the superiority of Islamic morals and standards. I could understand the resentment in people like that shopkeeper. It combined various factors. For instance, it used a certain idealization of one's own religion to divert one's disappointment at being stuck lower down in the social order than one was back home. Many Hindu Indians did something similar with the construction of Indian culture. I still recall the portly gentleman, the brother or cousin of a successful business who had settled in Denmark, who spent at least an hour at a party in the Indian embassy, basically boasting about the superiority of Indian culture to bewildered Danes whose notion of Indian culture mostly did not go beyond chicken tikka masala. The Danes did not understand this gentleman's driven need to relate real and imagined achievements of Indian culture. Neither did they appreciate his dexterity in jumping from discourses of purity to discourses of hybridity and multiculturalism. Everything was okay as long as he could prove to his own mind the superiority of India over Europe. The Danish guest could not know that when the colored immigrant does not, the Danish guest could not know that the colored immigrant does not just move up the economic scale when he immigrates. He or she also moves down the social scale in most cases. He might make more money in the so-called West, but he will also be conscious of a loss of prestige and place, further compounded by the fact that his entire culture or religion is seen as less, far less at times, in the West than it was back home. The resentment of such immigrants is similar to and different from Friedrich Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment, which might also exist in post-colonial subjects. This is so because while ressentiment arises from a sense of one's own inferiority or failure, usually projected onto a scapegoat, the resentment that I want to highlight here is not based on a feeling of inferiority. It is based on a feeling of deep personal and historical injustice. Actually, there is even a feeling of superiority behind such resentment. Its bitterness is rooted in a conviction of unfairness, of superiority, or at least equality thwarted by circumstances. Neither is this, like Soren Kierkegaard's resentment, the creation of a passionless age, where the masses have stifled all creativity and passion in individuals. The Pakistani Muslim shopkeeper and the Indian Hindu party pooper were very passionate and not at all convinced of their inferiority or the superiority of the West. But did I share the condition of such immigrants? After all, it was not the purity of my identity that I was worried about. I had sullied that many years ago in my small hometown, and I had done so willfully because I detested what was done to people and what people did to themselves in the name of this and similar forms of purity. I had also come to the conclusion that all given definitions of identity ran against the complex facts of history and were basically a simplification of them, usually employed by leaders like Hitler to empower themselves. The Pakistani shopkeeper's resentment and perhaps anger at Denmark and a generalized West was born of deprivation of some sort, and in this it shared of Nietzsche's resentment. But I did not experience even that deprivation, or not significantly. I did not feel that drinking wine deprived me of my Muslim cultural heritage, because for me that heritage also included the praise of wine in Ghalib's poetry and books like Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. Having taught myself about the ways in which cultures interpenetrate each other, neither my Indianness nor my Muslimness felt threatened or impoverished in the face of cultural and other differences. When faced with cultural imperialism, I could counter with facts and data. White triumphalism left me feeling hugely amused, not insecure or reduced. Formal education had little to do with this. Both the shopkeepers and the party poopers' educated definitions of the West and themselves were situated on old colonial binaries. For instance, that of science on the one side and religion, spiritualism on the other. And hence, white triumphalism left them feeling affronted and angry. True, like me, they did not feel inferior. but they were trapped in exactly the same discourses that enabled white triumphalism. I have since then met highly educated people from the East and the West, even a few authors, who are trapped in exactly that same kind of education. If it leads to open or hidden white triumphalism on the one side, it leads to resentment on the other. Not based on feelings of inferiority, but due to a gut feeling that one is not and has never been inferior. What one has been is trapped in certain discourses, trapped in certain situations. But I did not feel trapped. I had not come to the West seeking emancipation. I did not end up in the West feeling trapped. I had immigrated from choice, not compulsion. And my choice was personal, not economic or vocational. So, no, I told myself, while I understood the Pakistani shopkeeper, while I understood the Indian party-goer, the resentment I felt was not the same as what they felt. And yet, especially in the first few months, I did feel some resentment at Denmark and Danes. Now, there were issues of language and employment in the early years, but my resentment seemed to be in excess of my experiences, my travails as an immigrant. Where then did my resentment come from? Looking back, after years in which much more has happened to me, I have finally started understanding my resentment. My earlier sense of it was right. This was not the same as the anger and frustration of that Pakistani shopkeeper. And yet there was a thread, I would call it a post-colonial thread, running between us. To explicate this, I need to jump almost 2 decades and move on to an essay I wrote for The Hindu in August 2016. Starting with Donald Trump's cultural imperialist reaction to Khizr Khan, I argued that many of the right-wing or conservative political movements of today, whether it was the Tea Party in the US, Islamism in Muslim countries, Hindutva in India, can be seen as the attempt of men to latch onto their male privileges in the wake of real or perceived gains by women. I noted that Islamism and many branches of Hindutva have obviously sexist tendencies. But Trump, with his trophy wives, his Republican opposition to forms of family planning, his sexist language, his big male ego, was no different. I got many positive responses from Hindus and Muslims across the world, but there were also 4 or 5 angry postings. They were united by their perception of me, who they thought had sold out to the West, because obviously I was living in the West. They angrily listed all that is supposedly wrong with the West. I would list some of their complaints. What is wrong with the West? Promiscuity, suicide rates, racism, neglected parents, wayward children, failing families, rapes. The list was wrong and absurd in exactly the same way as a white racist criticizing colored cultures is absurd because it's exaggerated, it's taken out of context. But some of it was also based on actual and genuine critiques of Western societies, or more exactly, Western modernity. Once again, these people did not consider themselves inferior. If anything, they thought I was trying to assimilate to the West, as one put it, because I had bought Western notions of culture simply by conceding that some interpretations of particular Eastern religions could be sexist. They had their data right at times. To cite just one example, and I'll just give you one example because I don't want to exceed my 40 minutes. To cite just one example, numbers do indicate that rapes take place far less often in Wahhabi Saudi Arabia than in liberal Denmark. But numbers, as is always the case when dealing with complex human issues, are misleading. One has to contextualize them. For instance, by pointing out that rape within marriage is not recognized in Saudi Arabia, but it is in Denmark. Again, Saudi Arabia is a place where women are strictly policed and intimidated by the system, and men are allowed many liberties in the form of legalized, including marriage-based satisfaction of their sexual urges, while women can be strongly penalized for unproven rape accusations. So obviously, if you keep all that in mind, then you understand why, on paper, there are fewer rapes in Saudi Arabia than in Denmark. Reading these complaints I received of the so-called infamy of the West, I realized once again that when I had moved to the West, I had expected affluence, development, and all the rest. Fat burgers, wide roads, big cars. I had been totally prepared for them. As had the Pakistani shopkeeper and the Indian party pooper. I had even been prepared for so-called Western infamy. After all, much of the genuine critique of modernity, America, Europe, etc., some by leftist scholars too, some by post-colonial scholars, all of this was familiar to us. Basically, all three of us, the Pakistani shopkeeper, the Indian partygoer, and me, all three of us were totally prepared for modernity, with its lurid skyscrapers of success, behind which lurked the inevitable slums of dysfunction. I was even prepared for postmodernity, with its glorious images cast on the thin surface of an inevitable hollowness. The common notion, so often sustained by prize-winning multicultural novels based in the West, and mostly written by people based in the West, that the immigrant resents the modern changes encountered in the West, is not true of most immigrants. Most of them come prepared for the changes, and many have encountered its versions in the non-West too. I know now that in my case it was not what I had expected, call it modernity or postmodernity, that caused resentment. It was what I had not expected, because it has been left out of critiques of the West. My resentment rose from the confused, blurred realization, which grew slowly clearer, that this critique was partly untrue. The Denmark I encountered was not just a soulless place where families were falling apart and men and women fornicated in bouts of drunken absent-mindedness. Instead, it was a place of parks for children, of institutions that prevented most people from falling beyond a certain level. It was a society that thought seriously about relationships and responsibilities. It was a place of towns and villages where children could walk out alone without feeling endangered, and so could women. Neither was it a place without a past. As I slowly discovered, Europe, and for that matter, even America, was not just rushing into the future, leaving its past behind. Despite all the noise I had heard about history and culture in India, where I had grown up, where I had studied, despite all the noise I had heard about history and culture in India, both history and culture seemed less appreciated and cared for in India than in Denmark and other European countries. I recall going back to my hometown, Gaya in India, and discovering that the tall, sculpted 7th century stone temple had been cemented over by its caretakers. If the Nietzschean notion of resentiment applies to such resentment, it does so only to the extent that the immigrant, especially those like the Pakistani shopkeeper and the Indian party pooper, who come with strong notions of Western decadence, such an immigrant loses a position of easy superiority over the West in his own mind, which thus becomes even more powerful and threatening. It can happen at the personal level too. I started understanding my partial resentment during functions in my European wife's family. They reminded me of all that was seldom possible in middle-class families in places like India. I had grown up in a close-knit family with roots in a village near the town where we lived. But like many other middle-class families, we had not been able to create lasting secular festivities or develop religious occasions in ways that also turned them into secular festivities. This was probably more pronounced in my circles, as I had grown up in a religious minority, but generally speaking, the ease with which European atheists could celebrate Christmas was not available to us, for better or for worse. We had to choose between celebrating and not celebrating a festival in order to associate or dissociate from certain aspects of religious traditions. The option to be genuinely atheistic and still celebrate a once religious festival was mostly denied to us, both within the community and from outside it. We cared for children in my family in India and the families I knew there, but were unable to provide them with parks or safe streets or even the many options that children had in Europe, let alone the horrors of the post-colonial working classes, and we have seen those horrors being enacted in India during the pandemic, let alone the horrors of the post-colonial working classes. Even middle-class families in India seem to spend far more time around the TV set than families did in Europe, where there were more and other opportunities for families to congregate. Even education was a burden and shorn of choices for most of us in India. Careers were coercive. The sheer ease of personal or group fulfillment, yes, even that safe suburban existence so often ridiculed by the left, the sheer ease of personal or group fulfillment was far more difficult to obtain in post-colonial countries than in formerly colonial ones. Today, I'm aware that Scandinavian countries, with their effective social welfare systems, might offer the best examples of this in the West, and that USA, in particular, trails far behind Europe in these matters. And yet, the fact remains that there is much that is functioning in all these societies, and much that can be admired. By admired, I do not imply a nationalist pride based on imperial blindness. Far from it. Because for me, and surely this played a role in my resentment too, and was connected to the resentment of the Pakistani shopkeeper and the Indian party goer. All these admirable aspects are for me also rooted in a past of colonization and the present of imperialism. Having said that, however, it is important not to throw out the baby of Western achievements with the bathwater of Western oppression. Also because both were and are not solely Western. A discourse needs to be evolved that does not merely castigate Western hegemonies, because otherwise we will continue to run the danger of reacting with resentment or its opposite, abject adulation to what has been achieved in the West and underplaying non-Western hegemonies. Because otherwise we continue to run the danger of reacting with resentment to what has been achieved in the West and underplaying non-Western hegemonies. Because bear in mind, hegemonies are not just a Western monopoly. The consequence of these two dangers, taken to the extreme, are virulent forms of religio-cultural militantism in post-colonial societies, including Islamism and aspects of Hindutva. This discourse is slow to evolve in post-colonial circles, as our criticism for historical and necessary reasons has been focused on colonial and imperial injustices. Just as greed was easy a temptation for the possessor of rampant colonial power, resentment might be too easy for the post-colonial subject, who is made perpetually aware of her own deprivation, not inferiority, mark you, of her own deprivation when faced with much of so-called Western achievements. It is far too convenient to see the West, as many Islamist and Hindutva ideologues do, as simply and entirely a place of depravity, a civilization in free fall. In reaction, it is too tempting to take legitimate criticism of the West and turn it into fuel for something else, a dismissal of achievements of and in the so-called West, and a justification of failures and hegemonies in the non-West. In this sense, leftist and liberal Western criticism of the West can become something else when taken up and repeated in the non-West, unless it is matched by an equivalent criticism of the non-West too. And I can give you lots of examples of that. For instance, if you look, if you look at Noam Chomsky, a great critique of the West, a very sharp critique of the West, and you come across his criticism being used by Islamists in the Middle East. And the criticism, of course, is totally valid, but the purpose for which it is being used is totally different from what Noam Chomsky has in mind. His purpose is full democratization, greater agency, more responsibility on and acknowledgement of responsibility on the part of those who govern, and so on and so forth. And that is not the purpose of these Islamist groups who sometimes regurgitate Noam Chomsky's criticism of American imperialism. That kind of balance needs to be maintained. As I put it, leftist and liberal Western criticism of the West can become something else when taken up and repeated in the non-West, including in India, unless it is matched by an equivalent criticism of the non-West too. Of course, one cannot yet shirk the task of a critique of forces and tendencies in the West. To take just one example, the current media rhetoric on the muddle in the Middle East seldom takes into account the meddling of colonial Western powers that went into it, the creation of elitist oil economies, the subversion of democratic forces, the obstruction of nationalist initiatives by oil corporations supported by Western powers, and not least the introduction of arms sales as a balance of trade payment for oil. But when this critique comes from, say, a scholar like Timothy Mitchell, as in his book Carbon Democracy, it means one thing. When it is taken up and repeated by Islamists in the Middle East, India, or England, it means many other things too. A necessary, urgent critique of the West is turned into a kind of fruitless and self-defeating caricature of the West that, to my mind, resembles the colonialist discourses of native backwardness used to justify or obscure the greed of colonization. In other words, what it replicates is exactly what colonizers did in Africa, in particular in Africa, but also in other colonized countries. They took certain aspects of native cultures, largely looked at them in isolation, and used them to dismiss entire cultural complexes. And that is sometimes what we end up doing when we look at the so-called generalized West. To repeat myself, a necessary, urgent critique of the West is turned into a kind of fruitless and self-defeating caricature of the West that, to my mind, resembles the colonist discourses of native backwardness used to justify or obscure the greed of colonization. This leads not just to resentment of all the structures of powerlessness that exist, but also to resentment of those of possible empowerment. It enables reactionaries to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It reminds me of the days after 9/11, when even well-meaning Americans went about asking, why do they hate us? The question was faulty. I have never hated Danes or Americans. And I do not personally know any immigrant who does. But sometimes I've resented Danes or America. For some time, I supposed that my resentment arose from the historical injustices of colonization and current forms of imperialism. But inevitably, for some time, I supposed that my resentment arose from the historical injustice of colonization and current forms of imperialism, which inevitably leave post-colonial citizens and immigrants feeling not just deprived, but at times, physically, as in Iraq and Syria today, devastated. I supposed my resentment arose from the ordinary Dane's educated ignorance of this ongoing history, or her dismissal of it as something that was over. The get on with it sentiment, which is easier uttered than executed. But I've come to realize that there was another face to my resentment. This had to do with my own reluctance to countenance the political and personal successes of ex-colonial countries like Denmark. These successes were partly based on a history of colonization and the presently lopsided equations of imperialism, but that was not all the story. Not all of it could be conflated with post-colonial deprivation or devastation, as the ideologues of Islamism and Hindutva often did. If inheritors of colonialism mostly still need to face up to the rampant greed of imperialism, which is by no means over, the inheritors of post-colonial deprivation also need to learn to stop resenting what, despite everything, has to be admired. It is difficult for ordinary post-colonial immigrants to do so. It is difficult to walk under the grand trees of parks in Copenhagen and fail to note their colonial roots. It is difficult to visit the castles of Europe and fail to notice that most of them were refurbished or restored in exactly the centuries when the colonized nations were being looted. And yet, it has to be done, not just for the sake of those grand trees and houses whose beauty demands it despite the nightmares of the past, but also for the sake of the fragile and desirable civility of families, children, pets, students, friends, lovers in and around those parks. That basically is my presentation, and I think I have stayed within my 40 minutes. I had lots of other illustrations, but I leave them out, and I let you bring up opportunities to highlight what I have left out with questions. Okay. I must say that I suffer from hearing impairment. So if you say something and the sound is not very clear, there's a good chance that I might not hear it. So if you have questions, very specific questions, it would be a good idea perhaps to write them down. Okay?
So there is a question from J. Shamim Banu, research scholar in. Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. So there's a question from J. Shamim Banu, research scholar in Alagappa University. She has this question: how did Africans face post-colonialism, and how did they differ from Indian and Pakistan's post-colonialism? So I suppose she wants to know the difference of post-colonial Africa.
No, that's a good question. As I said, I did not come up with a very pedagogic paper. I gave you a paper that I thought would provoke you to think. But that's a very good question, because that's also one of the problems with post-colonialism. It's again a term that I do use, and I think it has done a lot of good, especially in Western academia. I also know that it's been under attack in the last 10 years. It's been largely replaced by what is now called world literature. I mean, I don't get to teach post-colonial literature at all in my department anymore. And I think this is not a good development. Post-colonialism had its limits, but it was still something that enabled a lot of things. And I think at least in places like India and Africa, we should not let go of it just because it has stopped being that fashionable in the West. It is still quite fashionable in places with huge immigrant populations like England and America, but continent Europe, it's it's been taught less often than it was, say, 15 years back. Okay, having said that, to answer Ms. Bano's question, there are a lot of similarities between what happened in South Asia and what happened in Africa. The similarities have to do with colonial power and the imbrication of colonial power with global capitalism. That kind of economic exploitation was common to both these parts in different ways. Colonies were sources of cheap, raw products and captive markets for the colonizers. And that worked in both South Asia and in Africa. But there were also certain differences. The most obvious one was connected to the fact that Indians were never enslaved, while Africans were enslaved. They were enslaved in a big way in the late 17th and throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th century. That was when capitalism was really building up globally. And even though in the West very often we have discussed capitalism in terms of industrial capitalism, there's a very good argument that capitalism did not start with industries, it started with plantations in the Caribbean, which were industrial plantations. They were not like farms. They were entire countries run with slave labor to produce crops that were then exported and sold in captive markets. So that was actually the structure of capitalism. It was a bit like a factory. Okay, and slave labor was central to that. Because of that, various discourses grew up in the West that particularly denigrated Africans, saw them as savages, as cannibals, as uncivilized, and so on and so forth. The pressure of those discourses was far heavier on Africans than it ever was on us in South Asia. We might have been seen as decadent, as childish, but we were still seen as belonging to an old civilization. Okay? And that difference should not be underrated. Bear in mind that Africa had old civilizations too. Africa had very complex civilizations. It had huge cities, and all of this was largely evaded. Many of these were, as in the Congo, what is now the Congo, were destroyed in the early phases of slavery. So that is the difference. And obviously, then there are the similarities that I like. I hope that answers it.
Thank you so much, sir. We don't have any other questions for now.
Thank you. I hope I have done what you wanted me to do. And
Yes,
I
sir.
will, of
Thank
course,
you, sir.
once in a while come in and listen to what is going on using your YouTube link. And thank you again for being here and for inviting me to be part of it.
Thank you so much,
It's a
sir,
pleasure,
for
sir.
being here.
Thanks, sir. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Now over to Surovi once again. Surovi, please carry on.
It's my absolute pleasure to be to introduce the last speaker of the day, Usha Kishore, and I'll introduce her to you. She was born in India and is a renowned poet, editor, and translator from the Sanskrit, who now resides on the Isle of Man, United Kingdom. Usha's poetry has been internationally published and anthologized by Macmillan, Hodder Wayland, Oxford University Press, and HarperCollins India, among others. Her poetry has won prizes in UK poetry competitions, which have been part of international projects, and features in the British primary and Indian middle school and undergraduate syllabi. The winner of an Arts Council Award and a Cultural Vannin Award Kishore's debut collection on Manannan's Isle was published in 2014 by dp.com UK. A second collection, Night Sky Between the Stars, and another book of translation from Sanskrit, Translations of the Divine Women, have been published in 2015. A third poetry collection, Immigrant, was published by Eyewear Publishing, London in 2018. Usha was conferred with the World Masala Lifetime Achievement in Poetry Award at the House of Lords, UK in 2016. An English teacher in the British secondary sector, Usha is currently a research scholar with Edinburgh Napier University, UK. Usha's papers on Indian poetry in English have appeared internationally, the most recent in the form of a literary dialogue on Kamala Das with the Indian academic Dr. B. Hariharan, professor at the Institute of English, University of Kerala. This literary dialogue was published in the academic journal Writers in Conversation, Flinders University, Australia. I would now like to hand over the space to Usha Kishore. Welcome, ma'am.
Namaste. Good morning to everybody tuning into this webinar from the Western Hemisphere, and good afternoon to everybody in India. I would like to thank SKBU University and BBTM College for inviting me to this August forum. As I was listening to the other speakers, I kept thinking myself, what am I, a research scholar from Edinburgh Napier, doing in this august body of scholars? I feel humbled and honored as I introduce my topic, my rereading of Sarojini Naidu, Mother India, Nation and Womanhood in the poetry of Sarojini Naidu. Before that, I would like to offer a special thanks to Dr. Jyoti Shankar Mondal, and Dr. Gautam Kumar Kar, for introducing me and teaching me about the finer aspects of share screen and PowerPoint, which I've been brave enough to produce today. So if I share the screen, please let me know if this is available here. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Not yet, ma'am. Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet.
Can you see it now?
No.
All right. If this is not successful, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Jyoti or Gautam to share it. If not, I can just talk to you.
Yes, ma'am. I'm
Okay.
trying. I'm trying. Just give
Okay.
us a few seconds.
Yes, Rita. I have also the PPT. You just give it a try. I have it.
No, if it's not possible, then I think I will talk to you
No,
about
it will be. It will be.
What I will request you, ma'am,
Yes.
is to carry on. I'm providing you the PPT support.
Okay. So basically, I think I should carry on, and then with the finesse of technology not working for me, I will start my paper. Right. Mother India, Nation and Womanhood in the Poetry of Sarojini Naidu. Postcolonial literature outlines three major aspects: history, culture, and language. But this is never straightforward. The three elements are like a jigsaw puzzle, never fitting together in a tightened fashion. If you examine Indian writing in English, we can see that the pictures do not exactly fit very well. So if you go into slide 2, we can see the three ill-fitting jigsaw puzzles. The ideological dimensions of modern Indian history, 1700 to the present day, rests on two opposing axes: the history of the empire and the history of the colony, which is slide 2, that is. Here, history is written in binary opposition: the record of the British Raj, where the glory of the empire is displayed to the best advantage of the colonial state. This is a master narrative, so-called master narrative of the West. Running parallel to this master narrative is the Indian perspective, subaltern history of the Indians that highlights imperial oppression and the nationalist movement. The culture and language follow suit, and the triad of history, culture, and language has come under great critical scrutiny in post-colonial studies. Would you move to this slide 2, please? And this triad forms the piece of a jigsaw puzzle and do not exactly fit in very well. You have the history of the British, history of the Indians, British English, Indian English, culture of the empire, culture of the colony, and this web of many histories, cultures, and languages emerges the native writer in English, Sarojini Naidu, or is she the nationalist poet? Now, if you look at, examine the critical readings of Sarojini Naidu, which is actually on slide 3, these are the following from 1962 and Nissim Ezekiel. It was Sarojini's ill luck that she wrote at a time when English poetry had touched the rock bottom of sentimentality and technical poverty. The new literary daughter of the West produces a pastiche of Western verse, another imitation of the East as shaped by the West, a doubled colonial mimicry of a European aesthetic. Ilke Bomer in 2005. But Professor Bomer does say that Naidu's poetry has to be read in the nationalist context. Finally, in 2000, Meenakshi Mukherjee, unlike Iqbal or Tagore, Naidu did not sing of the nation. She hardly wrote any patriotic verse. Now, let us go to some rereadings of Naidu. And what do writers like the late Meena Alexander say about Naidu, which is slide 4? Romanticism, through the force of a colonial British education, has led Naidu to resistance. Chandani Lakuge in the UK in 2013 says, Naidu developed the vision of the power of Indian womanhood to further effect by personifying, mythologizing India as Mother India. Santanu Das of Cambridge, Professor Das, in 2011, in his critique of the gift of India in World War I poetry, says, the gift of India is significant for the imagination of the nation and the writing of the Indian history. This war, panegyric, associated with the empire and patriarchal glory, is ruptured through the inscription at its heart of a powerful nationalist consciousness. Now, my lecture today is based on my rereading of Naidu. The poetry of Sarojini Naidu signifies one of the earliest literary and political emergences of Indian womanhood that participates in the process of decolonization. Written in colonial space, Naidu's poetry reflects the decolonizing processes around her and coincides with her involvement with the nationalist struggle. This is slide 5. It chronicles the processes of resistance in British India and simultaneously negotiates a very complex post-colonial feminist identity, often mediating between the opposing forces of empire and colony, nationalism and patriarchy. And she was initiated into politics by Gopalakrishna Gokhale in 1902 and introduced to none other than Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi in 1914 in the Imperial Centre, London. During this time, she was active in various organizations devoted to the welfare of women and children, and of course, the nationalist struggle. Her work challenges many arguments, including the very famous one of Partha Chatterjee, that the women's struggle during the nationalist movement was not in public spheres, and that women do not have a voice. These arguments, which disregard women, or shall I say a casual disregard or total amnesia towards political activists like Matangini Hazra, Kanakalata Barua, Aruna Asaf Ali, Sucheta Kripalani, and of course Sarojini Naidu, needs re-examination. This lack of recognition for women nationalists or for the work of the poetry of Sarojini Naidu is indeed a post-colonial stalemate. As regards the political and poetic contribution of Naidu, which are totally interlinked, there is a reflection of the subaltern space, where the nation is imagined and an alternative perspective for Indian womanhood is dreamt of. Because of her involvement with the women's emancipation movement and the nationalist struggle, Naidu's addressed to the nation is bipartite. The evocation of the gendered nation as Mother India, the discourse of the women's emancipation movement. Now, can you go back to the previous one, please? Yes. Thank you. No, the previous one. Yeah. Therefore, interest to the nation, as I said, is bipartite. This is the result of the preoccupation of the Indian nationalist movement with the figure of the woman. The nation has been conceptualized in the figure of the woman, especially Bharat Mata, Mother Goddess, the sacred deity in the Hindu iconography. And within this domain of the nation as the Mother Goddess, the women's emancipation movement created a subaltern space for itself that sometimes converged and other times diverged from mainstream political ideology. While examining Naidu's evocation of the gendered nation, we need to situate this in the historic context. Sugata Bose argues that the figure of gender has been central to a large array of modern and postmodern readings of colonial encounter. He locates a nation in the cultural context of the Bengal Renaissance and the female principle of Shakti or Mother Goddess. However, in exploring the idea of nation and the Mother Goddess, Naidu's intention has not been the creation of a Hindu national identity, but Gandhian secularism. This is illustrated in her Islamic themes, poems like Layli, Night of Martyrdom, Nightfall in the City of Hyderabad, and also in a polyphonic voices in Kali the Mother and poems like Ode to India and Awake. Speaking of some of Naidu's poems that address nation as a mother, the most prominent is Ode to India. Now, that is the next slide, please. Thank you. This is written for and recited in 1904 at the annual session of the Indian National Congress in Bombay, where a considerable amount of time was allocated to the women's emancipation movement, presided by none other than Ramabai Ranade, one of the first women rights activists of the Find Siècle nationalist project. At this session of the Congress, 25-year-old Naidu stands up and reads her patriotic poem, Ode to India, one of the earliest poems in Indian English, written by a woman proclaiming the desire for independence and featuring the gendered nation. The poem, composed in 3 quatrains, portrays the experience of colonization and the dream of independence. The opening quatrain evokes the mother nation, which is not a political and geographical entity, but a nationalist dream. O young among thy immortal years, rise, mother, rise, regenerate from thy gloom, and like a bride high mated with the spheres, beget new glories from thine ageless womb. If you look at the poem, it mimics Victorian verse in the form of the ode, the celebratory ode, its diction, alternate rhyme scheme, and structured quatrains. But the sentiment of nationalism is indisputable. The image of the bride high mated with the spheres, a portrayal of India as a bride wedded to many foreign powers. And this concept has been interpreted by the late Meena Alexander in political terms as the progeny of Keshav Chandra Sen. In 1870, Sen's sentiment takes a reverse turn as he portrays India as a prisoner of England, assaulted and bleeding later. Initially, in 1870, he says he tries to unify India, the bride with Britain, the groom. However, by 1883, he portrays India as a prisoner of England, assaulted and bleeding. Nationalists like Jawaharlal Nehru have also employed the metaphor of sexual assault in the critiques of colonial violence and aggression. And this simile of the colonial bride, wedded to imperial power and atmosphere of gloom within the colonial predicament, are both highlighted in Naidu's lines. Furthermore, the portrayal of the nation as a woman signifies the social reform that accompanies nationalist ideology. Actually, Naidu's nationalist sentiment anticipates Nehruvian discourse. In The Discovery of India, Nehru writes, the urge to freedom, to independence has always been there, and the refusal to submit to alien domination. On the political front, Naidu felt that India's nationalist struggle was part of a larger global struggle against oppression and colonialism. Her reference to nations in fettered darkness, where she says, the nations that in fettered darkness weep, crave to thee to lead them where great mornings break, waken, O slumbering mother, and be crowned, ones who wert empress of the sovereign past. Here, Naidu craves to the nation to lead other colonized nations towards empowerment, towards decolonization. And this is transferred to the poet's later commitment to international causes, as exemplified in her attempt to build an international solidarity against oppression by forging links with American civil rights activists during her 1929 travels to the USA. Now, the notion of India as a nation and a female body was in existence even before the realization of modern India as a geographical entity, acceptable to the West and the rest of the world. In the context of nationalism, I would like to revert to Sugata Bose, who attributes the usage of the name Bharatavarsha, which can be seen in the next slide, for the subcontinent to the political discourse of Bengal since the Hindu Mela of 1867. Mythologically or historically, Bharatavarsha, as you know, is an ancient name for India, derived from Bharata, the son of Dushyanta, or Saint Rishabha. Bose argues that the mother nation was popularized in pre-independent India as a means of unifying the many states and in sanctifying the nationalist cause. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, shall I say, was one of the first national leaders who sanctified nationalism, identifying the motherland with the Hindu worship of goddess. Chattopadhyay's Bengali hymn, Vande Mataram, do excuse me for mispronouncing in Bengali names, written in 1875, was one of the earliest verses to address nation as the mother. This ideology was incorporated by the painting as earlier shown of Bharat Mata by Abanindranath Tagore, which is so famous these days in 1905. But where does Naidu's poem Ode to India stand, the one written before the painting? That seems to be lost in the pages of history. Can the subaltern speak? The evocation of Mother Nation as a goddess spiritualizes politics by channeling the divine energy of goddess Kali into the symbol of nationalism. Subsequent references to the Mother Nation as a religious and cultural artifact arise from these earlier portrayals. Naidu addresses the nation as woman in many poems like Ode to India, Awake. It's also a reflection, or it's an intersection of the cultural renaissance of cultural nationalism of Swadeshi, which engendered this decisive cultural nationalism as illustrated in literature, including the poetry of Sarojini Naidu. Sanika Sarkar interprets the Mother Nation as a cultural artifact. In Indian nationalist discourse, the country is not a geographical entity. Abstracted and personified as a mother goddess, the most sacred deity in the Hindu pantheon, while the people of the nation are considered the offspring of the nation. And according to Sarkar, this imaginary nation of the mother nation forms a subordinate relationship. I would like to extend this argument and say the relationship between the nation and the people is that of a goddess and her devotees, as portrayed in Naidu's poems, Ode to India and Awake. Aurobindo Ghosh declares that the awakening of the slumbering nation occurs where the children are blessed with revelation. Naidu's poems are an extension of the ghost metaphor, where the slumbering nation is awakened by her enlightened nationalist offering. As regards to women's position in the nationalist struggle, we need to look at Mrinalini Sinha, who contends that the consolidation of a distinct Indian woman's position could only occur within the male nationalist discourse. In fact, male leaders promoted Naidu's political engagement. But it is also true that Naidu successfully created the symbolic figure of the mother nation in her poetry to represent not only the goddess, but Indian womanhood, dispelling the myth of patriarchal nationalism. The poet uses the metaphor of Mother India to engage the masses at a historic turning point by evoking the empowerment of womanhood through the empowerment of the nation. Here, a political myth intersects a subjective desire, as the poet carries the symbolism of the mother nation into a commitment towards a women's movement. The image of Mother India binds the politician and poet. Now, the Ode to India evokes Swadeshi tenets of reclaiming the nation's past. Naidu alludes to Mother Nation and her ageless womb and sovereign past, summoning India's glorious past to give voice to its future. This concurs with her 1917 speech, The Soul of India, and a reference to the golden age of Indian civilization. Let me read that to you. And highest proof of a country's civilization, the womanhood enjoyed a freedom and franchise unknown in the modern world. For the woman of ancient India had a lofty and legitimate place and function in the daily life of her race. In Tradition and Liberation, in the book called Tradition and Liberation, the Hindu Tradition and the Indian Women's Movement, Catherine Robinson argues that the Golden Age is a reference to the Vedic period, 1500 to 500 BCE, which was envisaged as a lost era of greatness. Robinson asserts that the idea of the Golden Age was informed by conventional perceptions of the past and influenced by the various Western ideas and assumptions. This notion of the other in Robinson's argument and the idea that Western influence shaped India's perceptions of the past need to be examined in the context of the nationalist historiography. Of course, we're all Macaulay's children, gone to the West and writing from the West and to the West and so on and so forth. But just to say that we were influenced by various Western ideas and perceptions need to be looking back. Can you revert back? Thank you. This is influenced by the past and the idea of Bharatavarsha and Vande Mataram and Bharat Mata. We have already discussed that. The need for a nation to historicize its own past, be it myth or magic realism, is the prerogative of the nation and cannot be suppressed by dominating cultures, nor it can be suppressed as accused of mimicry by Western post-colonial criticism. Ranajit Guha emphasizes the need for Indians to write their own history. The remembrance of the things of past, he says, in a people's life and for a people's own history are informed by the notion of the other. Let me actually reverse this Oriental ideology of the Western self and the Eastern other, and for one say Eastern self and Western other. The evocation of the idealized past by Naidu was based on nationalist ideology of seeking a cultural role to oppose British hegemony. Naidu's poem portrays an alternative historiography, a cultural alterity, to oppose the pervasive and powerful presence of the British Raj. And her allusion to sovereign past presents a nostalgic revisiting of a glorious past. It is not romantic. Of course, we have our reference in Rigveda, Gargi Vachaknavi, the 7th century philosopher, BCE, the woman who contributed to Rigveda verses. Similarly, Maitreyi of Veda and Upanishad, and Draupadi in the epic age, and Sita, so to say, who refused to go up the patriarchal route to Rama. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Jyoti? Can I be heard?
We can hear you. We can hear you properly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Carry on.
Okay, coming back to where the womanhood and India stands, let us go to Kalidasa, who sings Sarva Siddhyatmike Kalike, Kali, soul of psychic power. This is what Sarojini Naidu was referring to, and not just imitating the West. The poetry of Naidu resurrects the glorious past of India in order to create a national consciousness which is culturally different to imperial notions. Her address to the nation as mother and evocation of the ancient female heritage of India signifies a shift of paradigm from patriarchal nationalism. Could you go back to the previous slide, please? From patriarchal nationalism to women's emancipation movement, from empire to colony, altogether creating an ideological construct of identity and narrative outside imperial and patriarchal parameters. Jyoti, Gautam, could you go back to the previous slide? Not Sati. Thank you. Now, if you look at, the previous one. The previous. You've come forward. Go back one slide more. No, go back. Thank you. Thanks. If you look at the criticism on style of Sarojini Naidu, James Cousins in 1917 found in Awake, which is a polyphonic poem asking Mother India to awake. He writes in the Modern Review in 1970, this is an impoverishment of thought and figure. There is not an atom of cerebral stuff in the poem. The lines are exclusively rhetorical and in the rum-titty, tum-titty measure of the poorest English minor poetry. Following this, we have other post-colonial criticism. Verse is excellent. Poetry disappoints, says Rajiv Patke. Even Naidu's fiercest advocate, Makarand Paranjape, who says Naidu should be read in nationalist context, does say that some of her poems sound like childish jingles. My question is style the sole determinant of poetic quality? What about the thematic concerns? If you look at the Rhymers Club, where the exotic Oriental Naidu in 1895 went into the all-male Rhymers Club and was accepted there, we can see Yeats there, who has moved from Edwardian and Victorian signatures and moved forward from Romanticism into Modernism. But Naidu does not do that. He still sticks with this so-called minor English verse and conveys the major symbolism of Mother India. The address of a nation in female terms by a female poet writing in English is imperative, as it was a time when women were not accorded equal rights. Now, the notions of womanhood as depicted in Naidu's poems are crucial, as they can be reinterpreted in a post-colonial feminist light. Naidu at some point in 1918 asserted that, oh, I'm not a feminist and there's no need for a separate Indian women's movement. But does that stop Naidu from being an Indian feminist? Is my question. Despite fiery rhetoric, certain poems of Naidu present a self-contradictory note. These self-contradictory notes are recurrent in her speeches and poetry. In the poem Sati, she presents a very ambiguous reading, which provokes a great deal of controversy, suggesting a negotiation between women's emancipation and patriarchal tradition. The poem stands accused of Naidu's romanticization of the Hindu practice of sati. Let me translate the word sati from Monier Williams' Sanskrit dictionary: virtuous wife, practice of immolation on the funeral pyre of the husband. Now, again, there's a confusion between sati, the woman, and sati vrata or sati vrati, which is the practice. Also, please do not forget the name of the Indian goddess Sati Dakshayani, who immolates herself against the patriarchy of Daksha Prajapati. This is recorded in the Lalita Sahasranama as Dakshayani Daityahantri Daksha Yajna Vinashini. But in Naidu's poem, the woman mourns for her husband and contemplates joining him on the funeral pyre. Life of my life, death's bitter sword that severed us like a broken word, rent us in twain who are but one, shall the flesh survive when the soul is gone. Concurrently, in her speech in the Soul of India, she justifies and glorifies the practice of sati. Age after age, she vindicated the fidelity and fortitude, the courage and devotion of her love on the funeral pyre, which was so often the crucible of her purity, in defense of the Indian honor of which she was at once symbol and the shrine. If you examine the practice of sati or sati vrata, abolished by William Bentinck in 1829, advocated by the social reformer Raja Ram Mohan Roy, leading to the Hindu Widow Remarriage Act of 1856 by the efforts of another reformer, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. In this era of women's emancipation reform, sati again is an imprudent anachronism. The question arises as to why the poet is glorifying a tradition that a century earlier Ram Mohan Roy described as societal basis of female subjugation and the exploitation of vulnerable women. Ironically, Naidu uses the British spelling sati, S-U-T-T-E, signifying her hybridity, her mimicry, and her ambivalence in a colonial situation, if you want to call it that. Or can you read the poem as a negative reinforcement that behind the apparent glorification of sati is the hidden plight of women who were forced to immolate themselves on their husband's funeral pyre? Also reflecting a personal dilemma, her newborn feminism and idolization of the past, struggle between tradition and decolonization. In her Anglophone world, where on one hand you have Swadeshi, on the other hand you have decolonization and social reform, and on the third hand you have the empire. I think, as I said earlier, the pieces do not fit exactly well. Both the title and the protagonist of the poem can be read as entre or in-betweenness, described by Jacques Derrida and brought into the colonial situation by Gayatri Spivak in Can the Subaltern Speak, where Spivak questions the female lack of agency and expounds on the historical narrative of the complex and ambiguous situation of the goddess-centered culture of classical Hinduism that is considered feminist, and the British attribution of the term sati to none other than the ritual burning of the widow. Spivak, I quote Spivak, "The story of the mythical Sati reverses every narrative of the right." So in the Naidu context, Sati, the poem, is certainly ambiguous. Now, do I have the time to go on? Yes? Thank you. Thank you. So, in Rigveda, Book 10, Hymn 18, verse 7, it goes like, Imanari ravidavaha supatni rakhena sarpisha sambishantu anashravo anaviva suratna rohanti janayoni magre. Now, the translation into the alien language is, let these unwinnowed women with noble husbands, anoint themselves with fragrance and oils, adorned with gemstones, free from sorrow, let them go up to where he lieth. It celebrates the entry of adorned wives into their new abode or their entry into nuptials. Spivak argues that the word agre is significant because it was modified into Agne and was questioned again and again by Vidyasagar as to why the practice of adorned wives should go into unadorned wife and sati. However, Spivak does not consider verse 8, which says, Udirshva naribhi jivalokam gata sumetam upasheshayehi hastagrabhasya didishoshtavedam patyurjanitvam abhisambhabhuta, which says, rise, come unto the world of life. Come, woman, he is lifeless by whose side thou liest. This was thy portion with the man who took thy hand and wooed thee. Here the woman is asked to rise and come away from the funeral pyre, rather than the patriarchal misinterpretation of wife joining the husband, a sociocultural ploy to secure the widow's assets. Despite her commitment to women's emancipation, her invocation to a gendered nation, and the cultural nationalism, her ambiguity is pronounced in a panegyric of a tradition, patriarchal distortion of the Vedic text. Or do we employ Derrida's entre, in-betweenness? Derrida himself confuses entre, l'air den, to entre, entre, which is in-betweenness. And the passivity of Naidu's protagonist can be interpreted as hidden behind tradition is the romanticization of Sati, reminiscent of romantic and Victorian portraitures, as in Wordsworth Margaret and Tennyson's Lady of Shalott. Sara Suleri says the romanticization is the mode of cultural arrival. But is Naidu's romanticization justified? Is it sanctifying India's glorious past, or is an alternative reading necessary to reconceptualize the remits of colonial women, where the poet challenges both patriarchy and empire through her strategy of connotative subversion and provides a space from which the muted sex and subaltern can speak? I think we have to leave Sati that way with various questions. Now, we go to a next poem, Kali, the Mother, which summons the full force of Gandhian Stri Shakti, which is in total contrast to Kali, the Mother, the fierce Hindu goddess of destruction, more than a mythical entity. Naidu's poem lists some of the synonyms of Kali, such as Uma, Haimavati, Ambika, Maheshwari, as in polyphonic voices, the many faces of womanhood, included in Broken Wing in 1917, one of the most nationalist collections of Naidu. The potent force of Kali becomes a symbol for national awakening. O terrible, tender, divine, mystic mother of all sacrifice, we deck the somber altars of thy shrine with sacred basil leaves and saffron rice. All life, gifts of life and death we bring to thee, Kali, the Mother. To me, this is a reflection of Kalidasa's Sarvasiddhyatmike Kalike. As in a way, this polyphonic poem invokes Mother Goddess and inspiration for empowerment of women and nations. And the mention of political resistance, an invocation of traditional symbols to redefine the contours of colonialist ideology, or oppose them, simplifying the connection between religion and politics. So in gendering the nation under the metronym of Naidu uses the image of warrior goddess and creates an imaginary community of emancipated women. Chandra Talpade Mohanty calls this the third world difference. which is quite different to any third world, so-called third world categorization by the West, a cultural ideological other. We are different as Indian women to any other women in the West because of our Indian context. And the political ideology behind the endorsement of womanhood in Naidu's work, again, in the nationalist context, the struggle for women's emancipation movement is actually the concept of Stri Shakti, a highly positive interpretation of the Hindu feminine principle, which is secular. Rajeshwari Sundararajan argues that the Indian nationalists of the 19th century and subsequent decades promoted the image of the militant goddess, not only as a reformist measure, but to mobilize women in the nationalist struggle, providing an inspirational symbolic focus for the evolution of the Bharat Mata figure. Now, could you move to the next slide, please? Synchronous with her poetry, Naidu dominates the Indian feminist scenario for nearly 5 decades. One of those women who answered Gandhi's call for female participation. Her endorsement gave prominence to women's emancipation movement, which is already in force by 1904. She was active in various organizations as listed, some of them being accompanying Gandhi to the Second Roundtable Conference, President of All India Women's Conference, first woman President of Indian National Congress. Now, if you read her poetry along with her political involvement, then you can actually see that her feminism, a post-colonial feminism, evolves within the colonial framework, and the perceptions of feminist principle exist within a lengthy learning spectrum ranging from the influence of the fond-seekless suffragette movement to a more defined and aggressive feminism of the first half of the 20th century. Her feminism is a balancing act between tradition and contemporaneity, operating within many hierarchies: family, gender, social situation, communal status, religion. We have to examine Naidu's portrayal of womanhood and the political engagements within the context of the nationalist struggle and the women's emancipation movement. Naidu was one of the causative debates of the women's position in Indian sociocultural and political spheres. The cultural nationalism and the paraphernalia of a gendered nation akin to the mother goddess translates itself in the women's movement and the participation of women like Naidu in the national struggle, who after Jallianwala Bagh incident put away her Kaisar-e-Hind medal in protest. So the poetry has to be read, despite its ambiguities, within the nationalist context. If the roles of Naidu, the Nationalist and Poet Institute, a pioneering to join the complex issues of nation and womanhood, she can be interpreted as one of the earliest feminists of India, contributing to a distinct, indigenous, post-colonial feminism. Once again, I am reverting to Spivak and saying, for the figure of woman, the relation between woman and silence can be plotted by the women themselves. Naidu breaks the subaltern silence in the context of colonial production. The gendered metaphors in Naidu's poetry signify the matriarchal yearnings of a dispossessed land and feature the gender issues of the nationalist movement. The notions of nation and womanhood interwoven in Naidu's work, can you go to the next slide, please? If examined in the light of Indian nationalist and feminist critiques, would contribute substantially towards the imagining of a gendered nation in pre-independence poetry in English. She unsettles the contested collusion between patriarchal norms and colonial ideologies. Hers is a narrative of decolonization and historiography, with woman as author, woman as subject, and woman as theme. A woman narrating the nation, a woman protesting in poetry, imagining a gendered nation, historicizing the nationalist struggle. A narrative of decolonization. Thank you very much, and namaste. I will certainly take questions, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is from Rajut Shubhro Mondol, who's a research scholar in Raiganj University. And his question is, if nation is gendered feminine, how come we use patriotism, that is pater/father, to imply her, that is her nation, love/thought?
Thank you. That's a good question. Now, patriarchal, pater from the Latin word, I would actually say in most nations, nation is always gender feminine. But in Germany, they call it the fatherland. So it is actually westernized. We say patriarchy, patriotism, but again, patriotism, this is again highly westernized. I would say the linguistic element of post-colonialism, where a nation is gendered. In most countries, I mean, you have Mother Erin in Ireland, you have Mother America, you have Mother India, but then I must say that in Germany, they call it fatherland. Again, yes?
Should I move on to the second question now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. So this is from Rimpa Mondol, another researcher from Punjab University. And her question is, if we can juxtapose Sarojini Naidu and Bankim Chandra Chatterjee in similarity of their views about the connection established between nationhood and womanhood.
Yes, we can certainly. I mean, Sarojini Naidu was born Sarojini Chattopadhyay. She was Bengali, born to Aghornath Chattopadhyay. So basically, the influences of Bengali literature and Bengali culture, and also all the happenings in Bengal are clearly there. And that is where we can juxtapose, or maybe I think Sarojini Naidu was very much influenced by Swadeshi, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, and so on and so forth. But I must again point out that Abanindranath Tagore's painting is a lot more popular and famous than, again, Sarojini Naidu's work. And can the subaltern speak?
Thank you. There's another question from Dr. Surojit Sen, assistant professor from Netaji Subhash Mahavidyalaya, Udaipur. And this is more like a comment. And he's saying, it took a certain Edmund Gossip for Naidu to decolonize her poetry. What is your take on that?
Good. This is a question I was explaining. Thank you very much, Professor. Edmund Goss, of course, decolonized. Did he decolonize poetry? Or, of course, he did. I don't know about this. Sarojini Naidu needed the West. I mean, in her Anglophone world, in the colonial context, she was one of those Macaulay's children who went to the West. There she was accepted. And Goss asked her not to write about the landscape of Britain and England, but about the Deccan. Is this decolonization or is it stereotyping? What about Rudyard Kipling, who wrote about India? What about Jones and all those translations from Sanskrit, Ralph D.H. Griffiths, which I constantly refer to? They could write about India, but Sarojini Naidu was pointed towards India. This is the Orientalization of Naidu. Unknowingly, Edmund Goss decolonized her, but whether it was a willing gesture, we do not know. I would say it was the Orientalization of Naidu rather than the decolonization. The decolonization happened in the nationalist context within the women's emancipation movement.
Okay, I hope that answers your question. And there's one last question from Vyoma, who's a research scholar from Osmania University. And she is asking about the effect of Western feminism on Indian writing in English. If you could just briefly comment on that.
Now, I think whether we can, of course, we are influenced by Western feminists all the time. We are quoting Helen Sisu, Judith Butler, and so on and so forth. But when we analyze Indian literature, why don't we use Indian feminism? This is something which I've been arguing for. Why don't we use Chandra Talpade Mohanty? Why don't we use Rajeshwari Sundararajan? Why don't we use Spivak? Why do we have to go to the West for the interpretation of Indian literature? Is a question in reverse. Yes, we are influenced. As I said before, in the post-colonial world, we have to look at the Indian context and our feminist theories rather than the West, because the Indian feminism arose during the nationalist struggle and the women's emancipation movement, and those are the origins. And perhaps we would revisit or perhaps even discover Indian feminism?
Thank you, ma'am. Now over to Jyotida to continue with the session.
Thank you, Ushadi, for your brilliant lecture, and it's such elaborate and such thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much to be with us, and in future, I hope that you will join in our efforts. I would like to request Professor Nivedita Mukherjee to introduce our Dean, Professor Sonali Mukherjee, and she will deliver the
First
both
of
of
all, thank you, Dee, for a wonderful lecture. It was
Thank
really
you.
enriching. We all enjoyed it. And now I would like to request our Dean. She is from the Department of Bengali, Professor Sonali Mukherjee, always behind all the activities that Arts Department, Shidukanu, Birsha University is involved in, and it is nice to have her amidst us. And Sonali Di, kindly deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Nowadays, we all are going through a pandemic affected situation. Most of us are now locked in home, confined in our own little space, but at the same time, our urge for knowledge, our quest for innovative thinkings are not restricted in our small boundaries. Our academic activities, exercises, research works intended to gather invaluable resources in this pandemic affected period also. Sidhu Kanu Biswa University of Purulia is continuously nourishing these academic practices through a series of webinars. This 3 days webinar organized by the English department is also an effective webinar entitled Post-Colonial Negotiations, History, Literature and Culture. I thank from the bottom of my heart to our esteemed faculty members of English department for organizing this webinar. I thank our Honorable Vice-Chancellor, Professor Dipak Kumar Kar, our Registrar Sir, Dr. Nachiketa Bandyopadhyay, for their wholehearted support. I want to express my gratitude to Honorable Vice-Chancellor of Bankura University, Professor Narayan Bandyopadhyay, for his magnificent keynote address. I thank Associate Professor Aarhus University, Denmark, respected Tabish Khair, for delivering outstanding speech on post-colonialism. I also thank Ma'am Usha Kishore, research scholar, Edinburgh, Napier University, UK, for her unique speech. I thank all scholars, students, our system officer for making the first day of this webinar successful. Tomorrow, we will be assembled again for this webinar at 2 p.m. Till then, goodbye to all.
I just want to add one thing. During the whole session, almost 1150 people have watched the session on YouTube. That's all. I would like to thank the YouTube viewers, and as it is there in the YouTube, I think in future people will be benefited from all these lectures. Thank you all, and thank you Ushadi, thank you Sonali Di, thank you Nivedita Di, Surovi, Gautam and Aparajita Di, and here I end the broadcast.
Thanks.